The distant howl of a coyote tore through the evening air as Nicholas Dawkins slumped forward in his rocking chair, clutching a weathered letter in trembling hands, the last connection to his late wife Sarah. Dead. She was dead, and with her, every last ounce of warmth the Diamond Creek Ranch had ever known. The year was 1876, and for 3 months since her passing, the sprawling Montana cattle ranch had known only the sounds of creaking wood, whiskey bottles emptying, and the occasional curse thrown at God for taking her so young. The ranch hands had left one by one, unable to bear Nicholas's grief-stricken rage or his neglect of the once prosperous property. Even the livestock seemed to sense the absence of life, with the cattle lowing mournfully at dusk, as though they too mourned Sarah's gentle touch and musical laughter. On this particular evening in late September, Nicholas stared vacantly at the horizon, watching the sun dip behind the mountains that bordered his 1,000 acres. The distant rumble of wagon wheels barely registered until they grew loud enough to disturb even his alcohol-numbed senses. He squinted against the dying sunlight, making out the silhouette of a covered wagon approaching the main house. "Whoever you are, turn back," he shouted, his voice hoarse from disuse. "There's nothing for you here." The wagon continued forward, driven by a slender figure wrapped in a dark traveling cloak. As it drew closer, Nicholas saw it was a woman, her face partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. She pulled the wagon to a halt and climbed down with practiced grace, her boots landing firmly on Montana soil. "Mr. Dawkins," she called, her voice carrying across the yard. "I'm Nora Davenport. I've come about the housekeeper position." Nicholas staggered to his feet, confusion etching deeper lines into his already weathered face. "There's no position. I didn't send for anyone." The woman approached, removing her hat to reveal copper-colored hair tied in a practical bun. Her face was sun-kissed and framed with a few escaped tendrils that caught the last golden rays of sunlight. She looked to be in her mid-20s, with intelligent green eyes that held a depth of experience beyond her years. "Your foreman, Mr. Jenkins, wrote to me 6 weeks ago. Said you were in need of help to run the house." She pulled a folded letter from her pocket. "He's an old friend of my late husband's. I've come all the way from Kansas City." Nicholas scowled, snatching the letter. "Jenkins left 3 weeks back, took the last of the men with him." He scanned the paper, recognizing his former foreman's handwriting. "This was a mistake. I don't need a housekeeper. I don't need anything." Nora Davenport's expression remained steady, though her eyes flickered over his disheveled appearance, the empty bottles littering the porch, and the general disrepair of what had clearly once been a proud homestead. "Mr. Dawkins, I've traveled nearly 800 miles with everything I own in this wagon, night's falling, and I've nowhere else to go tonight." She didn't plead, merely stated facts with quiet dignity. "I'm asking for shelter until morning, then I'll decide my next move." Nicholas hesitated, a flash of the manners his mother had instilled in him momentarily breaking through his grief. "The bunkhouse is empty. You can stay there tonight." He turned to go back inside. "I'd rather sleep in the house," she said firmly. "I'll cook you a proper meal in exchange." He laughed bitterly. "Not much to cook with. Cupboards are as empty as everything else around here." "I've brought provisions." Nora gestured to her wagon. "I always travel prepared, Mr. Dawkins." Something about her self-assurance irritated him, yet it also struck a chord of respect. Without another word, he nodded curtly and retreated inside, leaving her to manage her own affairs. The house was a shambles. Nora surveyed the great room with a practiced eye, unwashed dishes piled in the sink, empty bottles scattered across tables, a layer of dust on every surface. The once beautiful home bore the unmistakable signs of deep neglect born from deeper grief. She recognized it well. Her own home had looked similar after Joseph died. She set to work immediately, lighting lamps and stoking the cold hearth into life. From her wagon, she brought in a sack of flour, some dried beans, salt pork, and a few precious spices she'd kept carefully wrapped. The kitchen was well appointed. Beneath its disarray, Sarah Dawkins had clearly been a woman who took pride in her home. Within an hour, the smell of fresh biscuits baking began to fill the house. Nora had found a starter of sourdough, somehow still alive in the back of the pantry, and brought it back to vigor. A pot of beans simmered with salt pork and onions, filling the air with the promise of sustenance. Nicholas remained in his study, determinedly ignoring the transformation happening in his home. But the smell the smell of fresh bread, penetrated even his fog of misery. It had been months since anyone had cooked in this house. Months since these walls had held any scent other than stale whiskey and unwashed man. When Nora knocked on his door to announce dinner was ready, he almost didn't answer. But hunger, genuine hunger, stirred within him for the first time in memory. The table had been cleared of debris and set simply with the few clean dishes she'd managed to find. Steam rose from the pot of beans, and a basket held 6 perfectly golden biscuits. "It's not much," she said, "but it's hot and filling." Nicholas sat awkwardly, feeling like a stranger in his own home. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My mother taught me the basics. The rest I learned from necessity." She served him a generous portion. "My husband died 3 years ago, yellow fever. After that, I took in sewing, then started cooking for the local saloon to make ends meet." Nicholas nodded, understanding something of her path. "How did you know Jenkins?" "Joseph, my husband, rode with him during the war. They stayed in touch. When Joseph died, Jenkins wrote offering help if I ever needed it." She sat across from him, her own portion modest. When his letter came about this position, it seemed providential. They ate in silence, Nicholas surprised by how quickly he emptied his bowl. He'd been subsisting on jerky and whiskey for weeks. "Tomorrow I'll help you find passage to the nearest town," he said finally. "Bozeman's a growing place. You might find work there." Nora's expression remained placid. "Mr. Dawkins, I didn't come all this way to be redirected. I came for work, and from what I can see, there's plenty to be done here. I can't pay you, the ranch is failing. The cattle," he broke off, unwilling to admit how bad things had gotten. "I don't require much. Room, board, and a small allowance for personal necessities." Her eyes met his directly. "In return, I'll get this house back in order and make sure you eat properly." "Why would you do that? You don't know me." "I know grief," she said simply, "and I know what it's like to have nowhere else to go." Something in her quiet determination reminded him painfully of Sarah. His wife had possessed that same unshakable resolve, the ability to see what needed doing and simply do it without complaint. "1 week," he found himself saying. "You can stay 1 week, then we'll see." Nora nodded, neither triumphant nor relieved. She simply accepted his terms as though she'd expected nothing less. That night, Nicholas lay awake in the bedroom he'd shared with Sarah, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of someone else moving through his home. The house smelled different of bread and soap, and the faint lavender scent that seemed to follow Nora Davenport. For the first time since Sarah's death, the ranch didn't feel entirely empty. He wasn't sure if that was a comfort or a betrayal. Dawn broke with unusual sounds, the clatter of cookware, the soft hum of a woman's voice. Nicholas dragged himself from bed, his head pounding from the whiskey he'd consumed after dinner. He'd meant to just have 1 drink, but old habits died hard. In the kitchen, Nora had already been awake for hours. Fresh bread cooled on the countertop, its yeasty aroma filling the air. Coffee bubbled in the pot, dark and fragrant. She'd found eggs somewhere and was frying them in a pan that had been scrubbed to a shine it hadn't seen in months. "Good morning, Mr. Dawkins," she said, not turning from her task. "Breakfast is nearly ready. I found some chickens still laying in the coop. They'll do better with regular feeding." Nicholas grunted, pouring himself coffee. The first sip nearly made him groan aloud. It was proper coffee, not the bitter sludge he'd been making. "The north pasture fence is down," he found himself saying. "Cattle have been wandering. I meant to fix it, but—" "I saw it yesterday," Nora nodded. "There's a young man at the general store in town who might help. The shopkeeper mentioned him when I passed through, said he was looking for ranch work." Nicholas frowned. "You've been to town already?" I rose early, took the wagon in for supplies. She placed a plate before him, 2 eggs, a thick slice of bread with butter, and what appeared to be preserves. "We needed essentials." "I can't pay for. I used my own money, Mr. Dawkins. Consider it an investment in my employment." He stared at her, baffled by this practical, straightforward woman who had inserted herself into his life with such quiet efficiency. "Mr. Dawkins," she continued, sitting across from him with her own plate, "I should be direct. This ranch is salvageable, but only with immediate attention. Your cattle are scattered, your fences failing, and your fields untended. Winter's coming. Decisions must be made." Her bluntness stung, but Nicholas couldn't deny the truth of her words. He'd been allowing everything his father and grandfather had built to crumble because he couldn't face living without Sarah. "What would you suggest?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. "Hire 2 men immediately, fix the fences, round up the cattle. Sell what you must to keep the rest fed through winter." She spoke with the confidence of someone who had managed land before. "The orchard needs pruning, but the apples can still be harvested and preserved." Nicholas eyed her with growing curiosity. "You know a lot about ranching for a city woman." "I grew up on a farm in Missouri before I married, and Joseph had a small horse breeding operation outside Kansas City." A shadow crossed her face. "After he died, I couldn't maintain it alone, had to sell everything," understanding dawned. "So you know what I'm facing." "I do. But your situation isn't as dire, not yet. You still have land, livestock, and a sound roof. With proper management, Diamond Creek could thrive again." Nicholas felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in months' possibility. The crushing weight of his grief momentarily shifted, allowing him to glimpse a future where the ranch continued, where Sarah's beloved home didn't fall to ruin. "The men in town won't work for me," he admitted. I haven't been the easiest man to deal with since Sarah died." Nora's expression softened. "Grief makes monsters of the gentlest souls, Mr. Dawkins, but good workers respect a fair wage and honest treatment. Let me speak to them on your behalf." Against his better judgment, Nicholas found himself nodding. "Do what you think best." Over the following days, Nora Davenport proved herself a force of nature. She hired 2 experienced hands brothers named Jacob and Thomas Wilson, who had recently arrived from Texas looking for work. They were sturdy, taciturn men who asked few questions and worked from sunrise to sunset repairing fences and rounding up scattered cattle. Inside the house, Nora transformed chaos into order. Rooms were aired, floors scrubbed, windows washed until they sparkled in the autumn sunlight. The pantry filled with preserves she made from the remaining orchard harvest: apple butter, canned fruits, pickled vegetables from the overgrown kitchen garden she discovered and reclaimed. Most remarkably, she did it all without making Nicholas feel judged for the state to which he'd allowed things to deteriorate. She simply worked alongside him when he joined her efforts, and continued steadily when he retreated into his grief. The smell of fresh bread became a daily constant. Each morning, Nicholas woke to that yeasty promise of sustenance, of care. It began to draw him from his bed earlier with less resistance. "My Sarah loved to bake," he told Nora one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the October sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. The admission came unexpectedly, the first time he'd spoken his wife's name aloud in weeks. Nora glanced at him, her hands continuing their steady rhythm as she shelled peas into a bowl. "Tell me about her," she said simply. The invitation opened something in Nicholas. Words he'd kept trapped behind clenched teeth spilled out stories of Sarah's laughter, her determination, how she'd come to Montana as a city girl from Boston and fallen in love with the wild country. How she'd learned to ride and shoot and birth calves. How she'd made this remote ranch a home that people rode miles to visit. "She was carrying our first child when the fever took her," he finished, his voice hollow. "I lost them both in a single night." Nora's hands had stilled, the peas forgotten in her lap. "I'm so sorry, Nicholas," she said, using his given name for the first time. "That's a burden no one should have to bear." "What about you?" he asked, suddenly needing to shift attention from his own pain. "You mentioned your husband, but little else." Nora's gaze turned distant. "Joseph was a good man, older than me by 12 years. He married me when I was 18, after my parents died in a fire that took our farm. He gave me security when I had nothing." She smiled faintly. "It wasn't a grand passion, but there was respect and companionship. When he died, I mourned him truly. No children, a shadow crossed her face. We tried, it wasn't meant to be. They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell, each contemplating losses that had shaped their lives. For the first time, Nicholas felt a connection to another human being that wasn't colored entirely by his grief for Sarah. It was uncomfortable, yet strangely comforting. The promised week passed, then another. Nicholas never formally asked Nora to stay, and she never again brought up the temporary nature of their arrangement. The ranch began to breathe again. Cattle were counted and secured in the pastures nearest the barn for the approaching winter. The hands built new feeding troughs and repaired the roof of the stable. November arrived with its biting winds and first dusting of snow. The mountains disappeared behind gray clouds that promised heavier storms to come. Nicholas found himself spending evenings by the fire with Nora, sometimes talking, sometimes silent, but increasingly aware of her presence as more than just a housekeeper. She had brought mercy to Diamond Creek Ranch not just in caring for its physical needs, but in showing patience with his grief, understanding his shortcomings without excusing them, encouraging his slow steps toward reclaiming his life. "Why did you really come here?" He asked her one evening as they sat shelling nuts for a pie she planned to bake. "You could have found easier work in a more civilized place." Nora's hands paused. "After Joseph died, I discovered something. The busier the place, the lonelier I felt. All those people in Kansas City, rushing about their lives while I was drowning in grief, it was unbearable." She met his eyes steadily. "When Jenkins wrote about a remote ranch in Montana that needed help, something inside me responded. I needed open skies and honest work as much as you needed someone to bake bread and remind you to eat." Her candor touched him. In that moment, Nicholas saw her not as his employee or even his friend, but as a woman beautiful, strong, and carrying her own carefully managed pain. "I'm glad you came," he said simply. A blush colored her cheeks. "As am I." The first major snowstorm of the season hit 2 days later, a howling blizzard that trapped everyone indoors. The hands bunked in the stable with the animals, while Nicholas and Nora were confined to the main house. Nora kept busy, organizing the root cellar, mending clothes, and preparing elaborate meals from their stores. Nicholas found himself helping her, rediscovering aspects of his home he'd forgotten in his months of grieving isolation. On the third night of the storm, the temperature dropped dramatically. Nicholas woke to find the fire in his bedroom had died, leaving the air bitter cold. He rekindled it, then checked the other rooms to ensure they weren't freezing. He found Nora in the kitchen, shivering as she worked to light the stove. Her room off the kitchen was the coldest in the house during winter storms. "This won't do," he said, frowning at the frost that had formed on the inside of her window. "You'll catch your death." "There's a bedroom upstairs next to mine with a fireplace. You should move there until the storm passes." Nora hesitated, aware of the impropriety despite their isolation. "I'm fine here, truly." "Sarah would never forgive me if I let anyone freeze in her kitchen," Nicholas insisted, surprising himself with how easily he spoke of his late wife. Nora relented, gathering her few belongings while Nicholas prepared the upstairs room, building a roaring fire that quickly took the chill from the air. Later that evening, they sat in the parlor, the main fireplace casting dancing shadows across the walls. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows with its fury. "I've been thinking," Nicholas said, watching Nora's profile as she darned a sock. "When spring comes, I should expand the orchard. Sarah always wanted more apple trees." Nora glanced up, a small smile playing at her lips. "That's a fine idea. The soil on the east slope would suit them well. And perhaps we could add to the kitchen garden, grow more than just the basics." "I'd like that," she said softly. "I've missed having earth to tend." Nicholas realized with a start that he was making plans that included her envisioning a future at Diamond Creek with Nora Davenport as a permanent fixture. The thought should have filled him with guilt. Instead, it sparked a warm flicker of hope. "Nora," he said hesitantly, "I don't expect you to stay forever. You've done more than enough already, bringing the ranch back from the brink. Come spring, you might want to move on, find something better." She set down her mending, her green eyes serious in the firelight. "Is that what you want?" "For me to leave when winter breaks?" "No," he admitted, the truth surprising him even as he spoke it. "No, I don't want that at all." The storm raged for 5 days, isolating them completely. In that time, something shifted between Nicholas and Nora. Their conversations deepened, touching on hopes and dreams long set aside. Nicholas spoke more freely of Sarah, finding that sharing memories eased rather than intensified his pain. Nora revealed more of her own past her childhood on the Missouri farm, her pragmatic marriage to Joseph, her struggle to survive after his death. When the snow finally stopped and the sun emerged, they ventured outside to assess the damage. The ranch had weathered the storm well, thanks to the preparations they'd made. The cattle were safe in the lower pasture, the buildings secure. Standing in the brilliant sunlight, with the world transformed into a glittering white expanse, Nicholas looked at Nora and saw her truly not as Sarah's replacement, not as his savior, but as herself. A woman of remarkable strength and quiet beauty who had brought life back to his home and, unexpectedly, to his heart. "I never thanked you properly," he said, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air, "for everything you've done here." Nora's cheeks were pink from the cold, her copper hair escaping from her woolen hat. "You didn't need to. I found what I needed here too. And what was that? Purpose. Peace." She hesitated, then added softly, and eventually joy again. "I hadn't expected that." Nicholas took a step closer to her, snow crunching beneath his boots. "Nor had I. After Sarah died, I thought that part of my life was over forever." "Grief tricks us that way," Nora said, "makes us believe we're betraying them by continuing to live." "Sarah wouldn't have wanted that for me," Nicholas acknowledged. "She loved this ranch, loved life. She'd be furious knowing I nearly let it all go to ruin." Nora smiled. "From everything you've told me about her, she sounds like a woman who knew the value of second chances." Nicholas reached out, taking Nora's gloved hand in his. "I think she would have liked you very much, Nora Davenport." Christmas approached, bringing with it a festive spirit that surprised Nicholas with its intensity. He hadn't expected to feel anything but dread at the first holiday without Sarah, but Nora's presence changed everything. She decorated the house with pine boughs and red berries, baked special treats, and even organized a small celebration that included the Wilson brothers and a few neighboring ranchers who'd been cautiously renewing connections with Diamond Creek. On Christmas Eve, after their guests had departed and the house was quiet, Nicholas presented Nora with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "It isn't much," he said awkwardly, "but I wanted you to have something." Inside was a silver brooch in the shape of a wheat sheaf, simple but finely crafted. "It was my mother's," Nicholas explained. "Sarah kept it in her jewelry box. I think she'd want you to have it now." Tears glistened in Nora's eyes as she pinned it to her dress. "It's beautiful, thank you." "I have something else for you as well," he continued, suddenly nervous. "Not so much a gift as a question." Nora looked up, her expression curious. "These past months you've brought Diamond Creek back to life. You've filled it with warmth and purpose again." Nicholas took a deep breath. "I know this isn't what you came here for, but I've grown to care for you, Nora, deeply. I'd like to offer you a permanent place here, not as my housekeeper, but as my wife." Shock registered on her face, followed by conflicting emotions. "Nicholas, you don't need to answer now," he added quickly. "I know it's sudden, I know your heart may not be ready, but I wanted you to know mine is." Nora's hands trembled slightly. "I care for you too, Nicholas, more than I expected to, but marriage. I came here seeking independence after years of being defined by my relationship to others." "I understand," he said, though disappointment squeezed his chest. "Your position here is secure regardless. I would never want you to feel pressured." She touched his arm gently. "It isn't a rejection. Just a request for time. Can you grant me that?" "Of course," he nodded, managing a smile. "Time is something we have plenty of at Diamond Creek." Winter deepened, blanketing the ranch in snow and confining activities to essential chores and indoor tasks. Nicholas respected Nora's request, maintaining a careful distance while still sharing the warm companionship that had developed between them. January brought another vicious storm, followed by a dangerous thaw and freeze cycle that coated everything in ice. During a brief warm spell, Nicholas rode out with the Wilson brothers to check on the cattle, concerned about access to water. They found the herd clustered near the frozen creek, several animals showing signs of distress. As they worked to break the ice to create a drinking hole, Nicholas's horse lost its footing on the slick ground. Horse and rider went down hard. Nicholas's leg caught beneath the panicking animal. Pain exploded through his body as he felt bones snap. The world narrowed to pinpoints of excruciating agony as the Wilson brothers frantically worked to free him and get him back to the ranch. Nora was kneading bread dough when they carried Nicholas into the house, his face gray with pain, his right leg clearly broken. She took charge immediately, directing them to place him in the downstairs guest room rather than attempt the stairs. "Thomas, ride for the doctor in Bozeman," she ordered, already cutting away Nicholas's bloodied pant leg to assess the damage. "Jacob, I need hot water, clean cloths, and the whiskey from the study." The break was bad. The bone had pierced the skin, and blood soaked the makeshift bandage the men had applied in the field. Nora cleaned the wound as gently as possible, her face composed despite the seriousness of the injury. "Am I going to lose it?" Nicholas asked through gritted teeth, sweat beading on his forehead. "Not if I have anything to say about it," Nora replied, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. "But it's going to hurt like hell before it gets better." Nicholas managed a strained chuckle. "Already does." For 2 days, Nora barely left his side, changing bandages, applying poultices, and forcing liquids into him to combat the fever that set in. The doctor arrived on the 3rd day, grim-faced but impressed by Nora's care. "You've likely saved his leg, Mrs. Davenport," he said after examining Nicholas and properly setting the bone. "The wound is clean, no sign of gangrene. Not many would know to treat it so effectively." "I assisted our local doctor during the war," she explained. "We had many broken limbs among the wounded who came through." The doctor left detailed instructions and promised to return in 2 weeks. Nicholas faced months of recovery, with no guarantee he'd walk without a limp afterward. The injury transformed their relationship. Nora became Nicholas's nurse, his confidante, his lifeline to the ranch operations she now largely managed in his stead. Their previous careful distance dissolved by necessity. She helped him bathe, change clothes, manage the most basic bodily functions. In his pain and vulnerability, he revealed aspects of himself he might otherwise have kept hidden. For her part, Nora discovered the depth of her feelings as she feared for his life during the worst of the fever. The possibility of losing him clarified what she had been reluctant to admit. She had fallen in love with Nicholas Dawkins. "You should have let me die," Nicholas muttered one evening during a particularly bad spell of pain. "The ranch would be yours. You'd run it better than I ever did." Nora's expression hardened as she adjusted his pillows. "Don't you dare speak that way. This ranch needs you. I need you." The admission hung between them, neither acknowledging it directly but both aware of its significance. February brought warmer weather and the first hints of spring. Nicholas began to improve, moving from bed to chair, gradually regaining strength. Nora continued to manage the ranch with surprising efficiency, earning the respect of the hands and neighboring ranchers alike. One evening, as Nicholas sat by the fire in the parlor, his splinted leg propped on a footstool, he watched Nora reviewing the ranch accounts at the small desk by the window. Lamplight gilded her copper hair, and her brow furrowed in concentration as she calculated figures. "Marry me," he said quietly. Nora's pencil paused mid-calculation. She looked up, searching his face. "Is this the pain medication speaking?" "I haven't taken any today," he smiled. "My mind is clear, Nora, clearer than it's been in a very long time." She set down her pencil and moved to sit beside him. "Nicholas, you're still recovering. Your circumstances have nothing to do with how I feel about you," he finished. "I loved Sarah with all my heart, and I always will, but loving her doesn't prevent me from loving you too." He took her hand in his. "You came to Diamond Creek and filled it with life again, with the smell of bread and mercy when I deserved neither. I don't want to imagine this place or my life without you in it." Tears spilled down Nora's cheeks. "I came here looking for a job, for independence. I never expected to find love again." "Nor did I," Nicholas admitted, "but here we are." "Yes," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "Here we are. Is that a yes to my proposal as well?" he asked, hope rising in his chest. Nora smiled through her tears. "Yes, Nicholas Dawkins. I'll marry you not because I need a husband or you need a wife, but because I love you. Because together, we've built something worth holding on to." They were married in April, as the first wildflowers bloomed across the lower pastures. The ceremony took place at Diamond Creek, with the mountains as their backdrop and their closest neighbors as witnesses. Nicholas stood without assistance, though he leaned heavily on a cane that he suspected would be his companion for some time to come. Nora wore a simple blue dress and carried meadow flowers. Around her neck hung a locket containing a small portrait of Joseph on one side and a lock of Sarah's hair on the other, acknowledging the past that had shaped them both. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching their first sunset as husband and wife, Nicholas pulled Nora close. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, "what might have happened if Jenkins hadn't written to you? If you hadn't come here when you did?" Nora considered the question, her head resting on his shoulder. "I think some journeys are inevitable. Maybe we would have found each other by a different path." "I like to think so," Nicholas agreed, "though I'm grateful it happened the way it did." Inside the house, fresh bread cooled on the kitchen counter, its yeasty aroma drifting through open windows. The sound of the ranch hands laughing carried from the bunkhouse. In the distance, cattle lowed contentedly in pastures bounded by newly mended fences. Diamond Creek Ranch was silent no more. It hummed with life, with purpose, with the promise of seasons yet to come. And at its heart stood two people who had learned that the greatest act of loyalty to those they had lost was to embrace the gift of love found unexpectedly in the aftermath of grief. As twilight deepened into night, Nicholas and Nora Dawkins remained on the porch, watching stars appear one by one above their home, planning an orchard that would bloom long after they were gone.